Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Greg from Atypical Engineer. Today we are talking about mounting React components, mounting a React component explained. Why do we need to know what mounting is? Well, component lifecycle methods, there's a lot of tutorials on those, and some of the most important ones in React are all focused around this thing called mounting. But many of the tutorials don't actually talk about what mounting is. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to know what mounting is. It's totally possible to write a beginner's project or to even be a React developer without really understanding what's going on underneath the hood when a component is being mounted. However, as is usually the case with programming, understanding what's going on underneath the hood will make you a better programmer, and it'll allow you to use the tools that you're using more efficiently. And on top of that, the concept of mounting isn't really difficult to grasp. You just have to know a little bit about the DOM to understand exactly what's going on. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Over the course of the next few minutes, we will talk about what exactly the DOM is and how does it relate to React. We will talk about what it is to mount and unmount a component in React. And then at the end of this video, I will talk about the component lifecycle methods that are triggered by the mounting and or unmounting of a component. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do here is talk about what the DOM is, or the Document Object Model. The DOM is a cross-platform and language-independent interface which treats an XML or an HTML document as a tree. Each node in the tree contains an object, which represents part of your HTML or your XML document. Generating the DOM from your source HTML is one of the first steps in what we call the browser's critical rendering path. That critical rendering path ends when the browser paints the result of it into your browser window. To make a dynamic web page, you need to be able to modify this DOM and then go through the critical rendering path again to reflect the changes on the screen. In order to do this, we have what we call DOM methods. DOM methods give you programmatic access to this tree. So using DOM methods, you can change the structure, the nodes, the styles, anything inside the DOM. So how does this apply to React? Well, let's take a look at the following code. And if you've used the Create React app before, then this code should look familiar to you. It's basically a pruned down version of the index.html that ships by default with Create React app. Let's think about how we can visualize this code in a tree structure. You can see that HTML is the root for the entire structure, and then it has two children, the head and the body. And the head has a child of title with the React app value, but the body is what we're interested in here, and more specifically, the div with an ID of root. So it goes HTML to its child body to the root. Now you might look at this and wonder, how on earth does React create an entire website with this as the only source HTML code? And that's a good question. The answer is that React is essentially an engine that helps you do DOM operations. So when you request your initial HTML code, this is all you get, the div with an ID of root, and then the rest of it is just React doing DOM operations with the div ID equals root as the parent of all of those operations. React doesn't always just automatically choose a div with an ID of root. So how does it know to use this specific div? Well, if you watched my previous video about the 5 files that you need to get started with Create React app, then you might remember this concept of a div with an ID of root from that video. If you remember back there, the index.js file had these lines 7 through 10, which is react.dom.render with the app component as its first argument, and with the result of a call to the DOM function getElementById with an argument of root, which will search your DOM for an HTML element that has an ID of root, just like we have in this code up here on the right. So all this is doing is inserting the results of the rendered app component into the DOM as a child of the div with ID equals root. The point at which that information is inserted into the DOM is what we call mounting a component. It's really that basic. React mounts your component when it inserts the rendered results of your component into the DOM. All of the lifecycle events that are triggered around mounting of a component happen whenever this event occurs. But remember, React can still just update the DOM. So the next time your component needs to change, it gets re-rendered, and then instead of completely reinserting the component into the DOM, React will just update it. So you won't get those initial component lifecycle functions triggered again whenever you update your component. You'll actually get different ones that indicate that the component was updated, but you won't get the initial component lifecycle functions triggered. Then whenever React deletes your component information from the DOM, it does something called unmounting, and that triggers its own series of component lifecycle functions. Really, it's just important to know when a mount and an unmount occurs and when they don't occur. That way you can use the component lifecycle functions that are focused around those events in the correct way. There is another thing to mention: what happens with components' children. Well, whenever a component is mounted, any of the children that are going to be displayed in the browser will also be mounted. So you have kind of a chain reaction. This could impact how you design your components, knowing that any children of something that gets mounted are also going to be mounted. This also means that in the example I showed above, where the app component is mounted into the div with an ID of root, that basically mounts the entire component tree, because we're mounting the top level React component into what is essentially the root of all of the React operations. Now, this isn't a video on the component lifecycle methods, but I do just want to take a second just to mention the important lifecycle methods that are focused around mounting and unmounting. First, you have constructor. Constructor is a function that is implemented in React class components, and the constructor gets called once just before the first mounting happens. So any data that you need in order to do the first display of the component, you need to initialize that in a constructor. The next function is called component.did_mount. Component.did_mount gets run immediately after the mount, so after the component is inserted into the DOM. This is good for things that you don't want to block the first render, like an external API call, or for things that require the component to actually be in the DOM in order to perform. The final function I want to mention is called component_will_unmount, and that function gets called right before a component is removed from the DOM. Component_will_unmount is good for things like cleaning up timers that are attached to a component that's going to be removed. If you don't do that type of things, you have basically a memory leak. All right, well, that wraps up what I wanted to talk about for this video. Here we talked about what is the DOM, what is the document object model, and how it relates to React, how React uses it. We talked about what it means to mount and to unmount a component. And we talked about just a few very basic component lifecycle functions, even though we didn't really go into too much detail. I'm sure I'll have another video up about the details of component lifecycle functions. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video or have any questions, please leave a comment. I appreciate it very much. And I will see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.